Exciting news to report. Our event, Inspiring Prevention of Eating Disorders and Body Image Issues, is going online. This is an eating disorders training event for sufferers, mental health professionals, counsellors, nutritionists, dietitians, personal trainers, and anyone with an interest in eating disorders prevention. And it is now online, bringing people together, sharing a passion for change around these issues. It is an event to inspire, educate, and connect with like-minded others. So why do we need this event? Well, we know that eating disorders are on the rise, and many people in our culture experience devastating distress around body image. And as a result of this, so many people are desperately struggling with their physical health, mental well-being, and self-worth. And we know that the incidence of eating disorders exploded in the pandemic, and we continue to experience the aftermath of this. And the Lancet Group recently published research in June 2023 revealing a 42% rise in eating disorders among teenage girls as a result of the lockdowns, with similar rates of self-harm in this demographic. We need change at grassroots level. We need to implement change in society, changing the narrative and helping people to find a newfound understanding around relationship with food, psychology, and body image. So be part of this change. We have brought together experts in the field to inspire and educate around prevention of these issues. And it's going to be a one-day event on the 30th of September 2023 online. We're going to be having lots of talks and workshops talking about the catastrophic impact of diet culture, looking at the early years as foundation for good mental health, talking about the hidden eating disorders with 85% of people not being underweight, looking at diagnosis, early intervention and support, talking about issues with men getting eating disorders too around muscularity, talking about improving body image and developing radical self-love, understanding a broader definition of health, intuitive eating principles, is sugar really the enemy, finding a healthy relationship with exercise and movement, dealing with diet culture, and lots more. So if you want to up-level your knowledge, be inspired, connect with others from all over the world and be part of this transformation, click the link in the bio of the show notes to get your ticket. Saturday, 30th of September. See you there. Hello and welcome to the Eating Disorder Therapist podcast. This is a podcast to help you find peace with food and overcome disordered eating. And I'm Harriet Frew, aka the Eating Disorder Therapist. And I'm so excited to share with you all kinds of stories, tips, information and guest interviews to help you on your journey in finding peace with food. So thank you so much for listening today. Now today I'm talking to Kristi Koeter. Kristi is a former journalist and personal trainer, marketer, and now author based in the Austin, Texas area. Two of Kristi's three children have had anorexia nervosa and both completed partial hospitalisation programs in the United States. Her oldest daughter, now 19, has been stable in her recovery for several years, whilst her youngest, 14 years old, is still earlier on in her recovery. When Kristi's youngest daughter's weight started dropping rapidly after she came out of treatment, Kristi knew that she needed to take more proactive action. She also ended up having to take a really hard look at herself, her own eating and body image issues. Using the Maudsley Method and her daughter's care team, this has really supported her daughter in transitioning in her recovery. In Kristi's just released and co-authored book called Show Your Work, Successful Women Share the Bumpy Roads to Their Biggest Wins, she discusses the realization that in order to help her youngest daughter recover from her eating disorder, she had to also address her own years of disordered eating and overexercise. She's also writing Almost Sated on Substack, where she's chronicling her transition to intuitive eating and healthy movement. She knows that it's possible for parents to help their children, even if they are struggling with their own eating issues, but she has felt passionate about working on herself to support this whole process. So when Kristi's not writing on one of her many books, she is mountain biking, hiking, or spending time with her kids and her new husband. So Kristi and her daughters are on an incredible journey. And Kristi herself has had to do some extraordinarily difficult and challenging work in facing her own demons in this process, which she is doing wholeheartedly. And I absolutely commend Kristi for her vulnerability and openness in talking about all of this, because this is not easy work. In this episode today, we're going to explore with Kristi all about what it's like to have two children with anorexia and how different the experience was with each of them, giving up dieting for the well-being of loved ones, tips for parents making the transition to intuitive eating and healthy movement after a lifetime of dieting and exercise, and how to raise children who have a healthy relationship with food and their bodies. So much value in this episode. Let's get to the conversation. Hi, Kristi. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Kristi, could I get you firstly, please, to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure, yes. So my name is Kristi Koeter. I am a writer, first and foremost. I am also a marketing director for a book publisher. And then I have a background in journalism. Newspaper journalism is where I got my start. And then I've been in marketing, transferring over to marketing for many years. And now I'm just focusing on writing primarily. And then I have 3 children and 2 daughters, 2 of which have had anorexia. So, my story is a little bit more interesting than a lot of parents with children with eating disorders, because I've had not 1, but 2 children.
Well, thank you for the introduction. And I think you're very sort of multi-talented there. And I'm sure now you're writing your own books, it must be great to have all that sort of marketing and publicity experience behind you and getting your books out there.
It is super helpful. And, I love the marketing almost as much as I love the writing. So it's kind of doubly rewarding. And then, I should mention this, I was part of a multi-author book earlier this year where I got to write about the experience of me helping my youngest daughter and then also making the decision to transition into intuitive eating. And so I know we'll talk about that some, but I just want to put that out there that, I did start with, writing a chapter about that experience. And I should back up and actually tell you that, we'll get into it a little bit more, but I've actually been chronicling my entire transition into intuitive eating. And so that's kind of what has led me here today.
Yeah, I know. Wonderful. And definitely, Kristi, we're going to get into your sort of story more. We will definitely be putting your book in the show notes, because I think people are going to be very interested in, hearing more about this, because it's so relatable. And I think just really want to acknowledge actually from the start, just your courage and bravery actually in coming on, in talking about these issues, because I really appreciate it's not easy.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, it's not easy, and I want to be so sensitive when I talk about this, because it's not just me that's having this, my family has been impacted by this experience. But, I'm hoping that by telling my story, I'm going to help other parents and other people going through these same experiences.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I know your experience in some ways is perhaps a bit unique, that you've had 2 children that have suffered from anorexia nervosa, which, I can imagine just hugely, hugely challenging for yourself, your daughters, your whole family. So could you tell us a little bit more about sort of your daughter's experience in terms of how much you're willing to share about this?
Yeah. So, you read this all the time that no 2 people have the same experience with eating disorders, and what works for one person might not work for another person. I can tell you, having 2 children with anorexia, that is absolutely the case. The experiences were very different for both of them. I will say they were both 12 when they were diagnosed. And one of them is now 14, and the other one is actually 20 today. It's her birthday. So she's pretty far. One of them is pretty far along in her initial diagnosis and recovery with anorexia. So I will start with, the similarities. They were both 12 when they were diagnosed. Both of them spent roughly 4 months in a Partial Hospitalisation Program, or PHP, at the same treatment center here in Texas. And that's kind of where the similarities end with them. With my oldest, she didn't have the same sort of, external symptoms. I didn't see or notice significant weight loss with her. What I saw was a child who was just very depressed. And so She was already in therapy, but I went ahead and sought out a psychiatrist, and, we saw him for a little while and tried different medications. And then he suggested that she might need to be evaluated for an eating disorder, which was a complete surprise to me because I didn't know that much about eating disorders at the time, but it didn't match what I had in my mind for an eating disorder patient. But I did get her evaluated, and she was ultimately admitted into PHP program. And I should specify that this was before COVID. So, there wasn't like a wait to get her into treatment. And it was, everybody was in person. All of our meetings were in person. She went in person. Parents went in person. Completely different experience than with my youngest. So for her, I was by that time much more educated on eating disorders. And so when she started rapidly dropping weight, that was my first thought. I remembered back to a lot of the parental education sessions I did with my oldest daughter. And I remember the director talking about, if you have one child with an eating disorder, you have a much greater chance of having another child with an eating disorder. So that was kind of always in the back of my mind. So right away, I suspected, okay, this is what's going on. But then, we were in COVID still. And because of this massive increase in eating disorder cases and mental health crisis during the pandemic, it took over 6 months to get her in with a specialist. And so during that time, I felt like, I don't really have, without this diagnosis, I don't really have a lot of action I can take on this. And, I was trying to kind of band-aid the situation, but obviously I was trying to get in and get that confirmation. She did see her pediatrician during that time, and his assessment was, she's very depressed, but she doesn't, in his eyes, did not meet the criteria for an eating disorder. And luckily, because I already had this experience, in my heart, I just felt very strongly that this is, an eating disorder. And so, we just waited out until we got in with a specialist and were able to get that diagnosis. And then right away, they were recommending she enter treatment. And of course, because of COVID, there was a delay in getting her in, and, everything was a little bit different. But she did eventually get into treatment in PHP, and she spent about 4 months there. This is where two different experiences with my oldest daughter. She entered treatment sort of determined to beat the eating disorder, which my understanding is that is very, very rare. And so she had very little trouble with complying with an eating plan after she got out. So I didn't really have like the relapse or huge struggles in the way that I did with my youngest child. And so when my youngest came out of treatment, and by the way, she was just really motivated to get out of PHP, but she left PHP under her target weight range. And so that really fell on us to help her. It was basically the burden of getting her weight up was going to fall to us at home. And that did not really work out for us initially because she was still, she came out of treatment and she was still wanting to have control over her, meal prep and planning and all of these things. And she was following meal plan for a little while. And then slowly she started restricting again and shrinking portion sizes and having fears around, had a lot more fears around food, and clearly still very undernourished and not thinking clearly. So I was faced with the decision of, should we send her back to treatment, or, did we want to look at another option? And she was very determined to not go back to treatment. And so, what became clear to me was I was going to really have to step up and set more boundaries around food than I ever had and fully take over meal prep. And that's what I did. we had and still do have a very good care team in place for her, but it just, wasn't going to be enough. I had to really step up and be in charge of food. And this is where a little bit of the conflict began, because I have had my own issues with eating for many years. And, I knew all the best practices and the things I should be doing to help my kids and support my kids. But I was still restricting food. I still had a, really complicated relationship with my body and exercise and all of these things. And so as I'm trying to help my daughter, there was also this little voice in the back of my head that was kind of like telling me, you know what you need to do. But I just was terrified of doing it, And so I just had this realization that all of the things I was asking my daughter to do were every bit as scary to me. And I felt like, a hypocrite. And I felt like, I needed to take this big step along with my daughter in order for her to get better. And, all along this treatment with my children, I had heard about intuitive eating and working with dietitians and nutritionists. I knew that was kind of the standard, what we would hope for is trying to get, at least for me, not for them, because they weren't in a place to do that yet. It may not be, but I knew that was kind of where I needed to go. So alongside my work with my youngest daughter, I also made this huge transition with my diet as well, and decided to stop restricting and begin my path with intuitive eating.
Were you able to sort of share with your daughter the journey you were on? Like, how much awareness did she have about your sort of eating?
So this is interesting because, I knew from my education in eating disorders, like I knew not to talk about, like I never talked about diet. I never talked about unhappiness with my body. I never said, we didn't moralize food in our house. There were no restrictions on food. And so I was trying to model the best practices, but, silently, I was not following those best practices for myself. So I did talk about, hey, I'm going to make this journey. I'm going to embrace intuitive eating as well. And, my kids, they got such a great education from the treatment that they've done that they were both like, okay, well, intuitive eating doesn't work for anorexics, or it doesn't always work for anorexics. And, it's not it's not always the solution, right? And so, which I appreciated, and later in my research now, I understand, okay, yes, some people it's not going to work for. But I was open with them and talking about what I was doing, but also we just had a massive shift in my household, because up until that point, before I realized like I've really got to take control of this, I had such an issue with food, and particularly dinner. This was something I uncovered because I started working with an intuitive eating certified therapist, right? I had a lot of trauma from my own childhood around family dinners in particular. So most of my adult life, it's not been a priority for me. Us sitting down to a family dinner and me cooking a family dinner, those were not priorities. In my mind, I was always like, I am a career woman first, and I don't like to cook, and I don't like to eat because it's so complicated. I have this complicated relationship. And so the transition I made had a huge impact on the entire family, because for the first time in my life, I just went all in on like, I'm going to take over family dinners, And also I should mention that, with this transition, I actually quit my full-time job. And so without having quit my full-time job, probably none of this would have been possible, at least, and not because it wouldn't have been like achievable, something I could do, but I would have just used me working full-time as an excuse for not doing the family dinner, right? And taking over all of the meal prep and all of this. So we had a huge transition in the family because of this. And actually, it was healing for everyone. We were finally kind of all sitting down as a family again and having meals. And obviously it was very rough in the beginning, lots of battles over food and meals and portion sizes and what's in the food and all of these things. But after we got my daughter, moving in the right direction, all of that became much easier.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you really went all in, didn't you, Kristi? I think, like your daughter was on the journey, but you yourself as well. I guess it sounds like, you were sort of, dealing with your own sort of trauma and issues around food. I guess with your daughter's developing anorexia, it sounds like that really kind of opened things up for you, I guess. And, you had to face things probably that maybe you just were living your life, I guess, beforehand, weren't you? I can really understand as well why you might have needed to quit your full-time job, actually, because I think it's some real investment, isn't it, to be able to face some of these issues that are really challenging for us, and to not only sort of supporting your daughters, but you're facing some really challenging things yourself as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I feel very fortunate that I was in a position to be able to make that decision. I know that not everybody can, but what just became very clear to me with my my youngest daughter, because she was struggling in a way that I didn't experience with my oldest. It became really, really clear to me just how important it was for us to resolve the eating disorder. Like if I just, in a way, I know it was so much more real. I felt like there is a real threat that I'm going to lose my child. And so I reprioritized everything around that. And really, I knew all along that I needed to make changes. I had known for years that I needed to address my own issues, but in a way, my child's eating disorder really made it clear to me that if I was going to help her, I needed to help myself. And so there was a lot of, that was a very strong motivation for me to do this thing that was terrifying for me as well.
Yeah, well, no, it sounds like it. And I think, I just really am very inspired actually just by how brave you have been in facing all of this head on, because I think it is not easy at all. Time for a short advertisement break. Friends, does it seem like I'm okay until I'm stressed, then I can't stop eating? Am I ever going to stop binging? I just can't slow down or relax. I can't tell my hunger and fullness, even though I think I'm eating enough. I'm fine with food till something happens, and then I'm restricting or emotional eating or not buying groceries again. I surround myself with body positive pictures, wearing more comfortable clothes, but I still can't stand my body and I fear gaining weight. You don't acknowledge, you might just not have felt a sense of safety inside you for recovery efforts to fully land. This means you might be living in chronic fight, flight, freeze or please, and you need new experiences of the threat responses softening that cause the eating and body image issues in the first place, so the recovery can actually stick. If you're seeking the missing piece in your food, weight and health recovery journey, consider trauma-informed nutrition counselling with Tracy Brown and Associates. Tracy can be reached at www.tracybrownrd.com/get-started. That's www.tracybrownrd.com/get-started to learn how to shift what has been too much or not enough inside for food to feel easy.
It takes so much courage. I think I applaud all these families struggling with eating disorders because it is so incredibly difficult. And I can tell you that, I'm kind of almost a year out of the worst of it with my daughter, and I have a hard time going back into that mentally. It's just so hard to think back to that time because it is so traumatic. And there's there's so much conflict, so much stress in the house, and so much fear and so much worry. And I feel like, I need to let out like a big breath of air that, we've gotten through this incredibly tough time.
Yeah, kind of like a sense of relief, I guess, but to be hopefully kind of out of the main sort of darkest times, probably a bit sort of tentative with that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know this very well. I mean, I feel like because of the nature of eating disorders, I feel like as a parent, I'm always going to be vigilant. And I feel like my children probably have to always be vigilant. We talk about this all the time. I have fears of, them getting sick or having a cold and losing weight unintentionally, and that kicking off, a chain reaction and putting us back into this situation. And so I'm not sure you ever get over that fear, once someone in your family has an eating disorder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's terrifying as a parent, isn't it? Incredibly challenging. So, Kristi, can I ask you as well, I guess having sort of, two daughters that have experienced eating disorders, and obviously like the causes of eating disorders are extremely complex. And I think, as a parent of someone with an eating disorder, it's very easy, isn't it, to feel, oh my goodness, I'm to blame. I've done something terrible wrong, and I think, it's a fear as parents. I think we all live with actually, don't we, in terms of, getting our child's relationship with food right and just, their mental health, etc. But I just wondered if you could just share a little bit, obviously, in terms of, protecting both your daughters' sort of privacy as well, but just in terms of like now kind of having come through the experience with both your daughters, going through the whole process, having more of this kind of overview of perhaps things that impacted the development for them of their eating disorder in terms of, perhaps the genetics or environmental things. Like, what sense do you make of for each of them? And was it very different really in terms of perhaps the contributing factors?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And, I know that genetics play a huge role in eating disorders and families. And so in many ways, it's not really there are environmental factors, but obviously you're born with some, predisposition toward these behaviors under the right circumstances. So I do, obviously as a parent, there's guilt in how you how you handle every single situation. I can't imagine, I have lots of guilt about how I handled my first daughter and my second daughter, and what I wish I knew then that I know now, and all of those things. But by and large, I see it as this was something my children were predisposed to. And it's not about blame. It's not about causes, but obviously I can't tell you really about my oldest and factors at play. It wasn't the same as my youngest. It was much more of a just, I think challenges in school and transitions. With my youngest, I know that she was definitely made fun of and bullied for her weight. And then I think, during COVID was very isolated. And I think that was kind of, what kicked it off for her.
Yeah, I know COVID was an incredibly stressful time, wasn't it? And, as you were sort of alluding to earlier on in the podcast, like the difference in terms of accessing treatment with your elder daughter compared to your younger daughter, and how different it was, I guess, just those few years on, and with the pandemic, with your younger daughter and being able to kind of access treatment in the same way. Yeah, no, well, thank you for that. And I think it's really complex, isn't it? And I think, I'm just really, interested to hear your perspective on that. So thank you. So Kristi, for you, in terms of like, giving up your own struggles, moving away from your own perhaps disordered eating struggles and stepping in more to that place of intuitive eating, how did you manage that transition? And do you have any tips for anyone who might be listening who's kind of wanting to navigate that journey themselves?
Yes, for sure. I want to be clear and just say that, when I started this process of researching. I haven't mentioned this, but we used kind of the FBT framework with refeeding my youngest daughter. And I was reading Eva Musby's book, Anorexia and Other Eating Disorders. And, it really became my go-to during that really tough period. But I remember, I'm pretty sure her book references this, that, even if you have your own issues with food, parents can still provide the support they need to their kids struggling with eating disorders. And I do believe that's true. In my case, it wasn't the right call for me. I really felt like if I was going to really help my child, I needed to help myself. And so that was what initially kicked my journey off with intuitive eating. And I started with the intuitive eating book, of course, kind of the starting point for a lot of people, and quickly realized that I probably needed to work with a therapist because I do have a lot of trauma in my past, around eating and just other issues in my life. And so I have been kind of shut down in my own body and not, one of these people that I'm not quick to be able to feel like where something's bothering me in my body and, how do I feel and where am I feeling this thing? And I just questioned, is intuitive eating going to work for me? Because I'm not really in check with my body. I've been disconnected from it for a long period of time. And so for me, it was really important that I start working with a therapist so we could address some of these, issues and traumas that I had so that I could really feel like, okay, I can come to intuitive eating and feel confident that, I can trust my body to tell me, when I'm hungry and trust my body to tell me when I'm full. So that was just super important for me. And I started chronicling all of this, my entire transition basically with intuitive eating and where I've been in this, with the idea that I would probably write a book about that experience as kind of a guide of sorts for other people, because I really felt like there are just some limitations with the intuitive eating book and with a lot of the material you can read online. It just felt like I had so many questions that weren't being answered. And I'm literally just now, starting to find little resources here and there that explain how I was feeling, my questions, my doubt, where I was in the process physically with my body. And so there's just so much I feel like is unknown with intuitive eating. And so, I wanted to make sure that I put it all down for me to go back as a reference point. And about maybe 6 months into intuitive eating, my therapist actually suggested I start a Substack, which is basically a newsletter platform for kind of sharing my transition to intuitive eating. And so I started that, and I've been writing pretty much every week for the last 6 months and putting this out to subscribers. Kind of initially, it was very much about kind of my transition and what I was struggling with in intuitive eating. But as time has gone on, it's, evolved a bit. And I'm now talking about kind of larger issues around body size and stigmatization. And because, initially when I started intuitive eating, I thought I had a food problem. I thought I lacked control and willpower and I was eating the wrong way and it was all my fault. How come I couldn't fix this one thing that was going to make me feel like I was a success, And the longer I go on in my own research and journey, I realize this is really a societal issue. My eating was just fine. My body was just fine. But we are so conditioned as a society to only, have this one acceptable size. And so for anyone that's not within that, it's just, this horrible kind of life experience where you're sort of beating yourself all the time. So that's kind of where I'm at with it right now.
It sounds like writing things down for you as well, and then sort of later on sharing it. That's been sort of very therapeutic, and you've been able to kind of go down those rabbit holes, I guess, and really answer some of those questions that you didn't find maybe in other books. Yeah, putting that down into a book or resources or the kind of Substack, is that what it's called?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like passing on that wisdom, I guess, to other people so they can start to sort of put it into practice too.
Yeah, for sure. I think there are a lot of great resources out there, but, there's not one single definitive guide that's going to get you to where you want to go. And I realize that it's not possible, because every journey is different. Everybody's journey in intuitive eating is a different experience. So I realize some of that is by design, but I do feel like, and I feel the same way with learning about eating disorders. There's so much information out there and you don't get it all at once. And, I remember having all these questions about, why we were approaching treatment a certain way. And it wasn't till months later when I'm reading somebody's book that I'm like, oh, well, this is the reason why.
And would you say for you, Kristi, with your own experience, sort of getting more back into your body, working on some of that trauma, perhaps being able to do some of that kind of more sort of somatic healing, connecting with your body again, has that been a very powerful part of you being able to embrace intuitive eating and your relationship with food?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So one of the things that I did with my therapist was EMDR. And I had heard about EMDR, but I never knew, what to expect with that. And it was hugely beneficial to me in resolving a lot of the trauma that I had through childhood, and specifically around eating. I had a verbally abusive father, and dinner time was the place where the conflicts, eruptions, explosions began in our childhood, in our household. And so I did some really just incredible EMDR sessions working around that, which really helped me kind of heal my own trauma with those experiences. And then just doing more work with my therapist in terms of feeling in the body, feeling emotions in the body. And, I do that now with meditation as well. I can't say that I'm the best at this. I still feel like it's a real struggle for me, but I've made a lot of strides in those areas to really kind of tap into, sense what's going on with me and my body, and be present with that and be kind to myself.
And it's so helpful you sharing this as well, Kristi, because I think there's so many people out there as well as mothers who struggle with their relationship with food and have, so much anxiety about, worrying about what's going to happen to their children and sort of wanting to get it right. And I think, hearing you saying this out loud and some of the experiences that you went through, I think it just opens the door for us all to have more compassion for ourselves as mothers as well, because I think often, back in the day, there wasn't really support, was there, for mental health in the way that there is today. I know we're still massively under-resourced, but I think there's so many people, I think, who are listening out there as mothers who just didn't get the acknowledgement or support that they needed. And then they've been living with, difficulties with mental health, difficulties with eating for a long time. But I think, I appreciate you just sharing this so much, because I think for some of the listeners, it will really open that door as well to compassion, and also perhaps being able to explore their own relationship with food themselves.
Yeah, for sure. The hardest part was, again, thinking, my whole life I've thought my problem is me and my eating habits, and I just didn't have enough control or willpower. And, I carried that with me through my entire life. Everything I done. I've had all of these, milestones and career successes and wins, and every success I've ever had in my life has been tempered by this voice in my head that said, but, you're not really a success because you still are bigger than you should be, and so it's been so liberating to not have that, to not feel that way now, and to know that it was never my fault. It's been so eye-opening to really understand that, like, this is my body. This is what my body was meant to be, the size that it is, and it really has nothing to do with me.
Yeah, and it's so helpful to hear these words out loud, because we're so conditioned, aren't we, by society to look a certain way, to aspire for a certain body type. And it sounds like you are moving more and more now to a place where you are sort of much more peaceful and accepting of the body you have and rejecting that societal conditioning.
Yeah. I mean, it's really tough. I'm still very much, there are days where I'm still battling myself. This is, I write about this still quite frequently, where I'm still battling sort of the idea of the former me versus the me that I am now. And what am I capable of in this new body? But I also have, I know that the problem isn't really me. I have now this logical understanding that we've got a society and this framework and these systems set up that frankly are meant to keep us in this state of not feeling good about ourselves. The new challenge is kind of like, how do I navigate this world where sometimes feels like nobody agrees or feels the same way? I feel like I'm kind of swimming against the current in terms of my feelings about, body weight and size and not wanting to diet or restrict.
Yeah, and I think it can certainly feel that way, can't it? But I think I like to feel like the collective sort of consciousness around this is growing, isn't it? To start to shift. I mean, we've got a lot of work to do, but I think there are more and more voices and there is more and more understanding of these issues. And I think particularly the Gen Z coming through as well can embrace all of this in a far healthier way than previous generations.
Absolutely. I was thinking about this. It was so ingrained from an early age that I was meant to be controlling my body, and my children, thankfully, one of the benefits of them going through this experience is they know very well that that's not true. They've had so much education around this that they're in a much healthier place. And I do think these younger generations, they're being raised in a time where there's way more, body acceptance and body neutrality. And so I'm really hopeful that they can not have these same struggles that my generation did.
Yeah, no, let's hope so. It does feel a bit more hopeful though, doesn't it? I feel in many ways. I know we've got the whole social media and everything else, which doesn't help things. I think as individuals, there's a lot more understanding, isn't there, from younger people about sort of appreciating diversity and acceptance and pushing back against all this kind of weight stigma, fat phobia, all these things. So, Kristi, where can people find you if they want to sign up for your newsletter, if they want to get hold of one of your books or like get in touch with you?
Yes. My book, the book that I co-authored is called Show Your Work, and it's available on Amazon. And then my primary focus is on my Substack right now, and it's called Almost Sated, and it's www.almostsated.com. You have to put the www in there for some reason to make it work on Substack. And so I would say those are the two best places to find me right now.
Okay, brilliant. I shall make sure that I put those links in the show notes.
Thank you.
Well, Kristi, I'd really like to just thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. Appreciate it so much. I think a very rare thing actually, just to have someone, like yourself, just being very brave and very open and talking about these very difficult issues so openly. And I know a lot of people are going to gain just so much hope and inspiration from this. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I love the work that you're doing. And I feel like, you are such a calming and grounded presence for people. So I really appreciate that you're out there also helping people.
Oh, thanks, Kristi. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation just as much as I did, and do go and check out all of Kristi's info in the show notes. If you're not following me already, do seek me out on Instagram at the Eating Disorder Therapist _, and you might be interested in joining my bite-sized eating disorder therapy if you are looking for extra podcast episodes, additional content, videos, and lots of value. It's only £5 a month, and you can try it for free for a week first. If you enjoy this podcast, I would be so grateful if you would follow, rate, and review, as it helps it reach so many more listeners. And thank you so much for listening today, and I look forward to sharing another podcast episode with you very soon.